Alrighty. So my name is Britnay Ferguson. I am a PA practicing psychiatry at a local Atlanta hospital clinic. PA is the preferred term for physician assistant. As a PA, I do a lot of the same things doctors do. I prescribe psychiatric medications some of the time, and I provide therapy almost 50% of my time. I think it's worth pointing out that I do not have any special training in forensic psychiatry, which is a subspecialty dedicated to mental health and the law. All of my experience with the legal system has come about working with my individual clients. At this time, nearly 100% of my clients are diagnosed with psychosis spectrum disorders, such as schizophrenia. Today, I would like to talk about the portrayal of mental health and stigma in the 2019 Joker film. Additionally, we're going to review the history of the character and highlight several formal psychiatric diagnoses. At the end of my talk, I have invited some audience members for this recording who I invite to share their reflections on my talk and the film. The Joker has been portrayed in many mediums by many actors. He first appeared in the debut Batman comic in 1940, and ever since has held reign as the quintessential arch nemesis of Batman. His backstory is typically vague, but in some iterations, he is the person who killed Batman's parents. Joker is commonly represented as having a mental health disorder. He's often described as a sociopath or a psychopath. Both of these terms are used colloquially and somewhat interchangeably to describe the mental state of people who are violent without remorse. Neither the words sociopath or psychopath is found in the current DSM, which in some circles is referred to as the quote-unquote Bible of diagnosing for psychiatry. DSM being short for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Since 1980, the term you will find in the official diagnosis book is antisocial personality disorder, and it is used to describe individuals who have a pattern of disregarding and violating the rights of others. It's worth noting that some mental health professionals believe this diagnosis should be separated to two terms, sociopathy and psychopathy, or sociopathy and psychopathy. Psychopathy or psychopathy is still researched independently today and is commonly used to describe a genetic predisposition to lack empathy. Neither antisocial personality disorder nor psychopathy require criminal behavior for diagnosis and can actually be a helpful trait to individuals in some situations. Not to be inflammatory, but discussion of the quote-unquote corporate psychopath is a common one in mental health circles, and how lack of empathy can help people amass billions of dollars while their employees struggle to earn minimum wage. Back to Joker. In the various media depictions, Joker is often depicted as either residing in, breaking out of, or being sent back to the Elizabeth Arkham Asylum. He is always depicted as chaotic, and he is always a killer. This brings us to this past year where we got a new Joker story. The 2019 film Joker, directed by Todd Phillips, starring JOAQUIN Phoenix as the eponymous character. People were not sure what to expect from a Joker origin story, and they were split once the film was released. Soft spoiler warning ahead. The very moment the first trailer was released, the film was controversial. I imagine it likely hit us hard due to the political climate of the time, centering on gun control, lack of mental health care access, and the wealth gap. Multimedia sites were concerned that the film would glamorize gun violence and inspire other would-be mass murderers. There was a lot of talk in the media about incel violence. The FBI released a warning after several threats for shootings were posted on the internet, and the NYPD was stationed at various theaters in New York on opening night. The film was also very popular. It is the highest grossing R-rated film of all time, and it is the first R-rated film to break $1 billion at box office. It earned 11 nominations for the Oscars, which is the most for any film in 2019, and it's also the most nominations for any comic book film ever. It ultimately took home the Oscar for Best Score and Best Leading Actor. From my perspective, Joker mostly got a lot of things right. It got one thing wrong, which was huge. But first, I actually want to share what I got wrong as an audience member. In the film, we know that Joker takes medication. We know he meets with a social worker at an outpatient mental health clinic. And we know he was previously psychiatrically hospitalized. As I mentioned before, I mostly work with people diagnosed with psychosis spectrum disorders such as schizophrenia. There are a lot of psychotic spectrum diagnoses, and they are unified in that each exhibits some form of psychosis. Psychosis being a medical term used to describe the following experiences: hallucinations, disorganized thinking and/or behavior, negative symptoms such as talking less or socializing less, and delusions. On first viewing, I thought Joker may have delusional disorder, a DSM diagnosis characterized by the presence of one or more delusions where functioning is generally preserved, i.e., people tend to still have relationships and can maintain a job. Delusions being false beliefs. Kind of like when 50% of the population believed that this dress was gold and white. I'm just joking. Delusions, in addition to being false beliefs, also must not be amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. And we all know now that this dress is really black and blue. I always knew, but now we all know. While I first thought Joker may have delusional disorder, I later learned that the director intentionally made Joker's symptoms vague and nondescript. I realized that the scenes I interpreted as delusions could have just as easily have been interpreted as common, understandable fantasies. So for example, who hasn't fantasized about being on TV or meeting your role model? I know I have, but I was seeing Joker through a clinical lens of mental illness. I bet some of you may think, well, what about the girlfriend part? Wasn't that definitely a delusion? I would in turn ask, do we, the viewers, know that this wasn't just a fantasy? Do we know Joker believed it without a doubt and despite conflicting evidence? Do we have any real idea what that experience was like from his point of view? Did we ever hear him say? I have had several conversations with other mental health professionals who felt undoubtedly that the Joker in this film was mentally ill. I've also had several conversations with others who were shocked to learn that I saw Joker's experiences as potential delusions. And to be frank, I think this is maybe why I love this movie and have rewatched it so many times and made an entire talk about it, because it elicits such different responses from viewers depending on their worldview and their lived experience. I want to talk a little bit more about the DSM and how we label people. Nosology is the branch of medical science dealing with the classification of diseases. It's how we diagnose. In 2013, the current DSM-5 came out. Just prior, there were a lot of talk about moving from a categorical way of diagnosing, i.e., you fit in this box or that box, to a dimensional or spectrum approach, where we would think about experiences on a continuum. The DSM uses terms like psychosis spectrum disorders, but the system is still by and large categorical. The DSM is also imperfect and highly contended by mental health professionals and advocacy groups alike. Some of the main issues with the DSM is that diagnoses are heterogeneous. It's possible for two patients to have completely different symptoms with no overlap and still be diagnosed with the same disorder. It is also possible to be diagnosed with multiple comorbid diagnoses that have symptoms that overlap, meaning that the same symptoms are present in both disorders and both diagnoses are given. And maybe most importantly is that there are many people with lived experiences of these diagnoses that find them to be disempowering and missing the point. They suggest that by asking, "What's wrong with you?" professionals fail to ask, "What's happened to you?" There's a growing movement in mental health pushing against current practices of pathologizing people's experiences, whether it's beliefs or voices or any other experience. Recovery is a term often associated with this idea, where there is a de-emphasis on specific symptoms. Instead, there's an emphasis on helping individuals live their best lives, whatever that means to them. Certified peer specialists are individuals with lived mental health experience who are certified to help others. Hearing Voices Network is a network of groups run by and for individuals who hear voices. And recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, a therapy I specialize in, is a therapy model used by healthcare professionals. For all three, the focus is on living your best life, not symptoms. I think this trend is so incredibly important because the fact of the matter is that stigma of mental health is real. Think to yourself for a moment, if you were in a car accident and you broke your bone, would you feel comfortable calling out of work the day after so you could rest and heal? Now think for a moment that the world is undergoing a global pandemic. You're getting a lot of mixed messages about how to best protect yourself from the disease, which is anxiety provoking. Your workload has tripled, the schools are closed, your children are at home while you work. Would you feel just as comfortable calling out of work to take a mental health day? My guess is the answer is no. And this leads me to the thing that the film got wrong, really wrong. Violence does not equate to mental illness, but stigma of mental health is so pervasive that most people take it as fact. As previously alluded to, the source material doesn't allow for much wiggle room on this front. Joker is always portrayed as a killer. However, I can't help but think, unintentional or not, the movie is mirroring society scapegoating mental illness in debates about gun control. It absolutely breaks my heart every time I meet a client for the first time. We're getting to know each other, they're feeling more comfortable with me, and they drop their voice to a hushed whisper. Okay, Brittany, so I want you to know that I'm having XYZ mental health experience, but I need you to know that I don't want to hurt anybody. When every other horror film reveals that the killer is an escaped insane asylum patient, it's no wonder to me why my clients so often feel the need to tell me that they don't want to hurt people. Did you know that one 2006 national survey found that 60% of Americans thought that people with schizophrenia, diagnosed with schizophrenia, were likely to act violently towards someone else? Okay, maybe that's not surprising to some. Well, 32% of Americans thought that people diagnosed with major depression were likely to be violent. This hasn't always been the case. Prior to 1980, the general public did not perceive those with mental health diagnoses as more violent. I've given a number of talks at this point on mental health stigma, and I've really struggled to simplify this complex issue of violence into a single graph or slide. I actually don't think it's possible to do that. But suffice it to say that most mental health researchers agree that the overwhelming majority of individuals diagnosed with a mental health disorder will never be violent, just like the overwhelming number of people will never be violent. And that socioeconomic factors and drug use are far more associated with violence than mental health is. Some statistics suggest that those diagnosed with a mental health disorder are actually 10 times more likely to be the victim of violent crime than the general population. I've put the name and link to a publicly available literature review on the bottom of this slide for those interested in looking further into the research themselves. I also have some additional references listed at the end of my talk. Of course, people with mental health diagnoses can commit acts of violence, just like anybody else, but the violence is not typically planned or premeditated. They are not likely to commit serial murder. It is far more likely to be reactionary violence, which is something I think that this film got half right. Every time Joker commits violence in this film, it is in direct response to being beaten up, lied to, or publicly shamed. While people with mental health diagnoses are not likely to harm others, chronic illness, whether medical or psychiatric, increases your risk of suicide. For example, 1 out of 2 people diagnosed with schizophrenia will attempt suicide, and 1 out of 10 will end their lives. Rates for the general population are not much better. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It was responsible for more than 48,000 deaths in 2018, resulting in about 1 death every 11 minutes. In 2018, 10.7 million American adults seriously thought about suicide. 3.3 million made a plan, and 1.4 million attempted suicide. This is something I think that the film got right. Thoughts, plans, and actions towards suicide are not uncommon in the United States. And Joker is seen throughout the film to be thinking about suicide, and he makes a plan to kill himself. Another thing I think the film got right is the portrayal of the mental health system. The clinic he goes to ultimately closes down due to lack of funding. Arthur wonders how, without the clinic, he will be able to get access to the care he's been receiving. It may not be true in every state, but in Georgia, there is little to no money in mental health. It is very hard to get access to treatment. I've met several government and/or administrative types who try to profess otherwise, but you can ask any single mental health care professional I work with. If you don't have access to health insurance, your options are severely limited. And there are about 240,000 uninsured Georgians. Back in the 1970s, inpatient psychiatric hospitals across America closed. It's referred to as deinstitutionalization, and was largely a good thing. There were many cases of abuse and neglect in these hospitals, and regardless, it was hard for people to live their best lives locked away in a psych ward. But we didn't build up the community resources to support the people who had previously been hospitalized. Since the hospitals closed, many people diagnosed with mental health disorders now reside in prison. It is estimated that there are 10 times as many people with mental health disorders in prisons than in state hospital beds. This graph could actually be slightly misleading. It is designed in a way that clearly shows a correlation between psych hospitals closing and people with mental health diagnoses being incarcerated. But it isn't as simple as out of the psych ward and into the slammer. It isn't a causal effect. But one reason this correlation exists is most certainly a lack of community resources to otherwise support individuals with mental health diagnoses. Some people may be thinking, well, at least when they're arrested, they'll get access to mental health treatment, right? Wrong. The National Alliance of Mental Illness, or NAMI, estimates that at least 83% of inmates with a mental health diagnosis do not have access to treatment. Okay. So let's set these issues aside and assume that a person is not incarcerated and they do have access to health care insurance. Then they can get into the mental health system and everything is fixed, right? Wrong again. In the film, the Joker asks his caseworker, "You don't really listen, do you?" I don't have any graphs or stats for this, just countless anecdotes. I cannot count the number of clients who echo Joker's statement here. They tell me they feel discounted by the medical system. No one cares about their individual story. And please, oh please, do not talk about anything weird or different beliefs. Hearing voices? Well, those are all in your head and you should really keep that to yourself. I'm not exaggerating here. I had a patient recently tell me that the reason why they liked working with me was because I treated them like a person. And that this was a stark departure from the countless other professionals they had worked with for over 40 years. Of course, I would want to think that this was just some sort of fluke. Unfortunately, I get that sort of feedback all the time. And in fact, I myself felt discounted in college when I sought treatment for depression. I felt like no one cared about my individual story or how I saw my experience with depression. There are a lot of reasons for this, many of which I personally would attribute to systems of power that encourage increasing profits over caring for people. But additionally, you can't see a person's mental state, which is, I think, part of the reason why it's so easily discounted. Medical issues can be invisible as well. In the film, Joker likely has Pseudobulbar Affect, a disorder characterized by uncontrollable laughing and crying. The pathophysiology is unknown, but it can occur in individuals with brain injury caused by many types of neurological disease, including stroke, tumors, and neurodegenerative gray and white matter disorders. Joker's diagnosis is doubted by other characters throughout the film. It is implied that they think he is either acting or lying. You know what else isn't seen? Poverty. And that's what I think that this film got really right. When you appear a certain way, secondhand clothes, maybe carrying your possessions in a bag or a shopping cart, people don't want to look at you, let alone talk to you. If poverty is seen, it's villainized. Why don't they get a job, make something of themselves? Aren't there shelters? They're probably on drugs, or worse, lazy. Attribution error is a social psychology phenomenon where people ignore external forces in favor of blaming the victim. The dynamic between the Waynes and Joker is a key example of this in the film. Which leads me to my final thought. At no point in this film is the topic of race or racial injustice explored. People of color are present in this film, but largely nameless supportive characters. Again, we could blame the source material. Joker and the Waynes have historically been represented as white. In our current political climate, this may seem shocking to some, but in medicine and mental health care, racial health disparity and inequity is considered an undeniable fact. I can't help but wonder if the lack of discourse on race in this film is another case of the film mirroring society, refusing to acknowledge how racial injustice and other forms of social injustice are often inextricably linked. So in summary, the film ignored the topic of racial injustice. In my opinion, the film got one major thing wrong. Mental illness is not the cause of violence. But the film also got a lot right. Joker may be a villain, but we villainize mental health and poverty. During Joaquin Phoenix's Oscar acceptance speech for lead actor, he talked about how he believed many of us are guilty of an egocentric worldview, and how thankful he was for film, which allows him to use his voice to bring light to important issues. I'll end this talk the way he did, quoting a lyric written by his late brother, River. "Run to the rescue with love, and peace will follow." So these are my references, and I will just leave them up for a second so people can screenshot them. And now I would like to open it up to audience reflections. Hello, everyone.
Hey.
Hey, so I'm Brittany. I'm the person that was just talking, and maybe we could go around and have everyone introduce themselves.
Yeah, I guess or who wants to start?
It's you.
I'm Tim, filmmaker out of Atlanta, Georgia, and pretty in love with storytelling and comics and film games in general.
And how many times have you seen the film?
Once in theaters.
Tara, you're up.
Tara, I've studied film. I have degrees in film production. I've worked in film, and I watched The Joker this morning.
For the first time?
No, I saw it in theaters, but I watched it again this morning.
And I'm Justin. I work with Britnay. I'm a psychiatrist, and I've seen the film twice, plus a few clips here and there.
And so, you know, for the people who are watching this later, I had told the panel, reflecting panel, that I didn't really come up with any questions. I was thinking maybe we could just kind of have a chat, like if anyone had anything either from my talk or from the film. I just want to kind of see where this goes. If this was a in-person DragonCon, I would just sort of open it up for questions. So same.
Going along with kind of the good and bad aspects of how they're presenting mental health and it being a film and like sympathizing versus potentially glorifying his more negative aspects because he is a villain but the hero of this film. I think it's interesting watching and reading interviews with Todd Phillips and how kind of resistant he is to like acknowledging the darker aspects of the presentation. And like, I understand wanting to humanize this character and like, if you make a whole movie about him, you have to love him. But I find it endlessly interesting that how surprised he seems by some of the interpretations, like going more towards like incels, for example, and glorifying mental illness and all these things. And just the whole film is somewhat courting that, in my opinion. Like, for better or worse, these are stigmas that you should be aware of if you're making this film. and also the audience it's going out to. It's a film about the Joker. It's going to largely appeal to a certain demographic of people, being potentially, not exclusively, but, you know, nerdy white guys who maybe feel unseen and unheard, rightly or not. So that's, from the first time I saw it, that's just something that's always stuck out about the film to me.
So can I clarify? So is what I'm hearing you saying is that there's this idea that maybe some of these actions are justifiable, and that maybe it's courting this idea that, like, okay, if someone goes and acts violently because they're an incel, right? They're involuntarily celibate, people won't sleep with them, then that's like, yeah, people were mean to that person, and it is justified why they would retaliate. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
To some extent, where, like, you're saying his violence is reactionary, and you're like, well, they were beating him up. They, you know, disenfranchised him in some fashion. Like, this guy was always kind of mean to him, and now he's been stabbed in the neck and, you know, beaten against the wall. So, like, well, if you're going to make him so sympathetic at the beginning, and he says you're supposed to be sympathetic with him until you can't be sympathetic with him anymore, like, you're still fighting most of the film where you've gotten the audience on his side. So at some point you're still like, but they are, like, they've always been doing this to him. So the people who do stay on his side, it seems silly to me that you are surprised that there is a segment of your audience who stays on his side the whole time.
I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on this idea.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. I'm probably, you know, I'm probably one of the few people who didn't like the movie. I felt like there's a lot of issues with it, and I kind of always thought about it in two categories. One is the source material. Like, it is nothing. It's nothing like the Joker from the comics to me, because one big thing was like they gave him a moral code. Like, he killed people who pretty much did him wrong. So I guess, like, while I was watching the movie, I never, and I'm not even to compare, but, you know, to Heath Ledger's performance, he was so unpredictable that in one scene he could laugh, in one scene he could shoot a guy with a shotgun. You never knew what you were going to get watching scene to scene. Where it was like, I was never afraid of him, because he's misunderstood, but, like, he was kind of picked on, and I guess that kind of goes into my second part, was like the other issue with me for this film was the script. Like, it just felt like really, it just didn't connect to me scene to scene. Like, it felt like a bunch of really cool vignettes, but, like, how we got from this scene to that scene just didn't flow with me personally. And it almost felt like the reaction, especially with the Murray death at the end, it felt almost, I don't know, like it didn't wait to the reaction of what was happening to him. And then another thing is just like how the mental illness is treated, how it's shown through the lens of him versus his mother, who also is mental ill, and, like, she's killed by him, and it's like, it kind of goes into how this movie treats people of color and women, where it's like, nobody's important but Arthur Fleck in this story. Like, that's how it kind of feels when you're watching it, or for me. And so I guess, I don't know, I just couldn't connect with him as a character. And I remember just walking out of theaters feeling very empty. Like, it felt like Todd Phillips wanted to introduce ideas about mental illness, but didn't have an actual voice about it. Like, it felt like everything he did was very tropey. The system has ran out of money. That's almost in, like, every movie about mental illness or something like that. And it just didn't really feel like he had a voice about what he wanted to say about mental illness. It was just like, here's mental illness, and, like, that's it. And I kind of always tell people, I always say, hey, like, watch Mindhunter, which is like a TV show about the FBI agents studying serial killers to catch other serial killers. To me, that show did a lot more about mental illness than this movie. And it's on Netflix, so it's a smaller scale, but it was just like, it was, I don't know, it's just better written too in a sense, but yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I remember the first time I saw the movie, I remember, and I was, you know, I had been aware of the controversy. I didn't see it like right when it came out, and sort of a lot of controversy around it. And I remember actively in the theater saying, I'm not going to sympathize with this character. And so I was kind of, you know, I had like a step back the entire time in that regard. And I agree with Tim's point about kind of, there's a lot of sort of moments in this movie where it's kind of stylized in a certain way, or but sort of as a cohesive narrative, I think I appreciate that idea that sort of what was the voice here, or what was sort of the unique voice in relation to mental illness. I'm kind of wondering, Britnay, you know, early on in your talk, you sort of referenced antisocial personality disorder, and then also kind of your initial diagnostic impression of Joker as you're watching the film. And I guess I'm wondering, in part, did you fall into a trap that we often fall into about like, well, what is the diagnosis here? And does Arthur Fleck have a diagnosable condition?
100%. I mean, okay, so just like stepping back a second, when I first watched this film, so I love Batman, and like, I'm a mental health professional, and like all those movies that I said, you know, where the person is an escaped person from a mental health ward and whatever, like I watch all those horror movies, and I feel really, really bad about it because I just like have always loved that sort of film since I was young. And I increasingly am like, why do I still watch these? You know, it's bad. I shouldn't. And okay, so I went and I watched the Joker, knowing all the controversy, but I like love Batman. I love the Joker. And so I go fully prepared to hate the film, like, and like be like, this was bad that I watched it, and this is bad, right? And I actually did feel that way when I left. Like my brother turns to me and he's like, so what did you think? Because like he knows like about my passion about stigma and stuff. And I'm like, well, I know I should hate it, but I did really enjoy it. That was my first thought. And I was thinking the whole time, that first time, you know, what is this meant to represent? Like maybe, yeah. And I was like, is this supposed to be schizophrenia? Like what symptoms am I seeing? Whatever. And I was definitely looking at him really clinically. And it wasn't until I made this talk, but it was originally made for a different format for Pachakacha, that I realized like, wait, why did I even think that? Like why did I just assume that I had to diagnose him, right? Because I knew he's been in a psych hospital, because I knew he's been prescribed medicines. Like, I don't know that when I meet any of my individual clients that those facts alone mean that they warrant a mental health diagnosis. We get it wrong a lot. And so definitely falling into the pitfall of that. But I think, you know, I am trying to justify still really liking this film. So I'm thinking about some of the comments that other people made, and like, what is this specific narrative, right? What does this specific story have to say about mental health? And maybe none of this was intended by the director, right? But I did read that he meant for it to be vague, right? And for people to really look at this person as a human and as an individual, and to really to think of him as his individual characteristics, and not just like, I mean, at no point does he say the diagnosis, and that was intentional. Like, he doesn't have one, and he was made to not have one so that you could think of him as more of a human. And I do think while many other films get it much better, I did appreciate that aspect of this. And it really made me think about why, even with all the work I've done trying to not stigmatize people, that I so quickly jumped into that mode.
Well, and my understanding is of like the history of the Joker character is that, you know, you said that the backstory is typically vague, but my understanding is actually that it's intentionally vague, that there are many different origin stories and we never know which one is really true, which I do think that this version did a good job of like keeping us on our toes in terms of, you know, I mean, ranging from, is he in a psychiatric hospital the entire time and this is all a fantasy in his mind, like everything that we're seeing, versus, you know, what is exactly his mother's story, who is his father, who, you know, there's sort of all these different moving parts that and we don't really know what's true and what's you know, and what's made up, or what's fantasy, or what's a symptom. So yeah, I mean, it keeps the audience guessing in that way.
This also might be me giving Todd Phillips too much credit, but is making the backstory known, right? Is that sort of demystifying mental health, right? So like a lot of people have heard the word schizophrenia and they have no idea what it means, right? They just know it's like something really bad. It's like worse than cancer, you know? And like the truth of the matter is it really isn't. Like people diagnosed with schizophrenia, people who hear voices, people who have delusions, like can like have jobs, they can have children, be in a happy marriage for 30 years, you know, and like they could actually like have these experiences and never get a mental health diagnosis. So I guess I'm curious people's thoughts of if that is effective in saying like, okay, here's this classic villain. We all know him, right? He's always in the psych ward and he's super chaotic, but like what led to that? Right? Like, is it that mental health is just the scary, unknowable thing that like leads to violence? Or is it that like, no, it's like, we just like choose not to look at it. Right. And like, here's a more in-depth look at one possible story.
Yes.
You don't have to agree, but I mean,
I know, but it was real quiet. And that's a valid consideration that I will be pondering about later, but I still come back a little to the medium that you're choosing to tell this is a very specific character with a lot of like history and expectations and inevitabilities and popularity, just because he is a very striking character. So I feel like, I don't want to say, I'm trying to think of a better word than like naive, but like a little not as considered maybe as he thinks for like what he's doing with this particular character and like the continuing ongoing discussion and representation and reaction that it's going to have, just because of who this character is and has been and will continue to be. And just like trying to like, I want to throw my 2 cents in, and then just being like, oh, these are where the chips are falling. Well, everybody's interpretation, like it's not my fault if this is what you read into it. Like,
yeah, that's
you
the
made
feeling
it.
you get from Todd Phillips. That's the feeling, yeah, I get from Todd Phillips a lot. Especially because, like I said, it just doesn't to me feel like the Joker. I always thought like, man, it would be. I actually had an opposite like quest than Britney, where it was like I was really hyped for this movie prior to it coming out, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be cool. Like it's its own thing. You know, it looks like an 80s Scorsese film. It's like Taxi Driver. It's like King of Comedy. But then, like, as I was watching it, it felt like shallow interpretations of those. Like, it was trying to be those movies, but didn't have the substance of them. And I always wonder, like, well, what if this wasn't the Joker? Like, would this movie be more interesting if it wasn't the character that we all come to like have these preconceived notions about who the Joker is? And to a fault, like that could be why I don't like the movie as much, because to me it's like, is this it? And also it really felt like we gave a voice to a mass shooter, which is really weird to me. Especially like, I think it was the trailer or something, like was around the anniversary of like the Aurora shooting. So it was just odd to me that like nobody's kind of making these connections or seeing these things. And yeah, it's just like I've seen a lot of things he's done in this movie, done in other movies, but better. And so I guess that's like another issue I had with this film, where it was just like, oh, this is Kings of Comedy. This is Fight Club. There are like whole characters in this movie you could remove and doesn't change a thing about the plot, which in my opinion, as far as writing goes, is kind of an issue. But yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking about this idea of, is it okay to sympathize with Arthur Fleck or not? And I'm thinking about it from my perspective as a mental health provider. And, we think about, as you set up in the start, from the start, Brittany, about this, the story of, Joker's in and out of an institution, an asylum, it's suggested he's crazy. And then this story kind of says, well, here are some reasons maybe other than mental illness, a quote unquote mental illness, that this person is troubled, right? He had an ill mother that he's taking care of more than is taking care of him, and also likely neglected to do so when he was, put him in harm's way when he was a child. He's experiencing trauma on a regular basis. He's poor. He's overwhelmed with stress. He has limited to no social support. And Brittany and I know that's enough to make people have be in very difficult circumstances. The part about it is, the part that I kind of struggle with is that, well, then there's this violence part. And I think one aspect that the violence plays in this is like, it makes it a lot more difficult to decide, potentially a lot more difficult to decide to be sympathetic with the character. Because if he wasn't violent, then you would just be like, wow, this guy just gets treated like shit. And, I feel really bad for him. But then it's like, well, am I like, can I feel bad for him? Like, I don't know. Because I don't agree with him shooting someone because they were mean to him, or even because they beat him up on a train, or that they mocked him in front of a national audience on TV. So the violence there is like, it makes it a lot more harder to say like, is it okay to feel that what has happened to Arthur throughout his life is not okay? It's not okay that he's had, he's getting beat up. It's not okay that he's poor. It's not okay that he has no social support. And, I have to say that, like, in the work that I do, we see those stories those are common themes of the people who then are so desperate for help that or their families are so desperate for them to get help that they come into the mental health system, and then a diagnosis is given to them, labeled whatever you want to say, and the stories often get lost because everything gets attributed to the mental illness.
Yeah. So asking what's wrong with you instead of what's happened to you.
I mean, I love the way you put that. Absolutely.
That's not mine. That's from the Hearing Voices Network.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that they commonly say. Yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted to ask you a challenging question. I think you more or less answered it, but I'm just going to ask it anyways. Arthur Fleck is your client. You've been working with them. And it's like, I don't know, 2 years later, you're doing rounds in the hospital and they're there and you hear what happened in this narrative. Can you relate, feel sorry, feel empathy for Arthur Fleck, your client?
you know, I think the answer has to be yes. Feeling sympathy or trying to better understand does not mean that you condone or think it's okay or say it was an acceptable response. You know, I kind of got this like kind of deep sense of, I don't know, like I felt it in the pit of my stomach when you said Arthur Fleck's your client. You know, and kind of because I think that in some ways, you know, some of the ways that this story applies is I'm always learning more about the people that I work with. I never know the whole story, right? For a variety of reasons, even for people that I've worked with for a very long time. And so letting that understanding emerge in a more natural way over time, instead of trying to fit someone into a box, is really important. So I could keep going, of course, but I'm going to hold off. But I do want to say one thing that I really had a problem with about the movie as a mental health provider, which is when in one of the opening scenes with his social worker, and he says, "I'd like you to ask the doctor to increase my meds," and then she says, "Arthur, you're on seven meds. They must be doing something." And there are multiple levels of which I was kind of frustrated with that response. But actually, just the fact that I was kind of angry at this narrative of you know, over prioritizing the medication, and also this idea that he's on 7 meds, and it's sort of implied that they're all mental health medications. And Britnay and I know, even for people who are kind of the, you know, clients that are having the toughest time that we work with, 7 medications would be a ton. Anyway, so I just had to point out that I was, you know, kind of frustrated with that part of the story.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I struggled. I wanted to put somewhere in my talk that like there's this idea that I think it came across to me. I don't know if it came across to you and Tara, that there's this implication that because the clinic closes down and he's like, well, how am I going to get my medication? And then that leads to
Yes.
the violence, right? And so, I mean, kind of to Tim and Tara's point, like that isn't really, that's not challenging the way we look at mental health. That's actually like feeding a very stigmatizing narrative and saying like, like this guy ended up killing people because he didn't have medication.
Yeah.
And that's the only
Justin
thing.
specifically says when the 2 guys come over to his apartment and he stabs what's his face, "I stopped taking my meds. I feel a lot better now." I'm like, okay. have fun when you're about to just go right off the rails right now. You pretty much just started the Jaws music. So that also read where I was like, that seems like a pretty easy explanation, and be like, well, he was kind of okay, but now he's off his meds. Like, he wasn't doing super great to begin with. Like, his meds weren't helping all that much, it seems, to an outsider. So I agree.
There's also a thought I had about, okay, so I asked this challenging question to Justin about, would you feel empathy? And I guess I would say yes as well. If Arthur Fleck was my client, I feel like that would be my job, right? To understand this individual and to not demonize him, and to understand his story. But to the comments about incel violence. So I'm kind of curious to hear y'all's thoughts about this, but I guess I would also say if I was working with an individual and I don't know if people self-identify as incels, I don't really know how that works, right? But let's say if somehow I ended up taking care of a person who fit that mold and then did something violent, or I don't know. I also would work to understand that individual. And to me, trying to understand where someone's coming from doesn't mean that you're going to condone things that are objectively wrong, right? So if someone kills someone, like that's never okay, right? If someone rapes someone, that's never okay. And it's never going to be. But I still think that maybe just because I'm a mental health provider, I don't know, I'd like to think because I'm a human, like I want to understand where people are coming from. And even if it isn't justified, I think that it is still understandable. And so I didn't really get to talk about this idea about what white supremacy and white patriarchal society, like what that has to say about this story. Tim was saying like, okay, this is a film about a white man and all the women, all the people of color, they're just like there in the background, and that this is what this story is about. And I've read some articles where it talked about, well, like maybe like that is the thing that isn't said in this film that's like really actually kind of interesting. The idea that you're told because you're a certain color, you're a man, certain things should be given to you, right? And if they're not, then that is like a travesty, right? Then you are like denied your right as a white man. And so does that make it justifiable to go out and do horrible things? Like, no, but is it more understandable about how white supremacy and the patriarchy actually hurts everybody, including white men?
I talk about that aspect a lot with my husband, where like all of the women in this movie are either his mom, who he hates to some extent, or Black women who are somehow like emasculating him, or he's like really deeply frustrated with, and just they're all there to be some kind of problem to him or not understand him. Like, well, it's a good thing that women are people too in this movie. But then that, like, the whole film kind of functions as the presentation of his narcissism. So it makes sense that women are just nameless problems, but is also frustrating as a woman watching it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of feel the same about, you know, the Black people in this movie. The character I was speaking about earlier was Zazie Beetz. Was like, you know, you can completely remove her character and it doesn't really change the plot of his, like, what he was going to do anyways. So it was just kind of, I guess, disappointing that, you know, Todd Phillips had all of these representations, but just didn't use them. And I guess, like, it's interesting what you say about, you know, I guess by telling a white man he can't do these things, is that an interesting conversation. But I guess for me, I just feel like, well, almost 90% of films is that. So it's like, well, what makes this one so special? So I guess that's why I couldn't really. It was weird. I felt like when I watched this movie, I was just very, like, not reactionary, but just laid back. Like sometimes when I watch movies, I'm very into it. I'm like, you know, I am drawn into what's happening with the characters. But this one, it was just like, it was just like I was just there, kind of not zoned out, but just like not engaged with what was happening to him as a character. So I don't know. Yeah.
So from a film perspective, a lot of it was just me thinking, here's another moody white guy who's not getting the things he wants in life, so now he's going to act out and punish everyone around him.
Yeah. Well, another thing too was the initial incident on the subway. I think I kept like racking my mind around it. I was like, well, it was self-defense. Like it wasn't like he killed someone out of spite or hate. It was these guys were literally jumping him. So I guess it goes back to like me feeling like like Maury's death didn't really warrant his earlier actions. Like, could he not have just explained, I was defending myself on the subway? Instead, the death went on to become like this myth of like what's happening and the growing violence in New York. And then he admits it on TV, and it's just like, yeah, but like that wasn't, you didn't spitefully kill those guys. Like it really, I don't know. I viewed it as self-defense, but it felt weird that he couldn't, a lot of things would happen to him, but I guess maybe Todd feels the same because he's mentally ill. He couldn't explain them, but like same thing with the opening scene. These kids like beat him up with his own board, but yet he doesn't explain to his boss what happened. So I don't know. It just felt very halfway, I guess, about mental illness. It felt like Todd Phillips really was like, I want to make a Joker movie, like, but it not be about the Joker. Like, I don't know. It's really weird.
I have a question for the group that is coming to mind, which is, were this film to come out this October instead of, or whatever it was, this year instead of last year, in the context of the sort of national consciousness having at least working towards a better awareness of the true systemic racism and racial injustice in our society, how do you all think that the film would be received as opposed to when it came out last year?
I think it might have read a little worse, just because like Zazie Beetz' character has no real function except to be terrorized by this crazy white guy who lives next to her. All the other Black characters are nameless. He either is in a mental hospital the whole time or he goes to one at the end, but he's just like murdering people with relative impunity. Like he admitted to murdering 3 people on the train, self-defense or not, and shot someone on live TV, and they're like, go over here. We're gonna put you in this not super seemingly locked down mental hospital. Like it didn't seem like there was much security. I don't know what mental hospitals are like. I readily acknowledge that, but it kind of just seemed like none of the consequences for his actions were really that bad. And the really climactic ending of the movie is him being gently lifted out of a police car and dancing on a cop car like he's literally a hero. He's the hero of these masses. Like he's kind of a terrible person. Stop it. So I think it benefited slightly from coming out slightly sooner.
And his laughing condition is done by the third act. Like it just doesn't exist anymore once he's in the third act, which I always thought was funny. But yeah, I think the same way. Like I think if it came out, this year, I don't think it would have won or been as Oscar buzzworthy as it was. Or at least I hope it wouldn't. But yeah, I think it doesn't really service any women or people of color like this movie in particular.
Yeah.
Brittany, do you have any thoughts?
No, my literal thought that was going through my mind at that time was, I think that you can look at the piece and ask these questions about race and gender and disparity and injustice, but I think to me it's pretty clear that the director did not, right? And that anything that is gleaned from that is from the viewer. And I think if it came out this year, I mean, would it still have been, so Todd Phillips said that he didn't plan a blockbuster, which like, you chose Joker. But would it have been a blockbuster? I mean, I don't know, but maybe we would have been having more conversations about what this film had to say about race by not saying anything about race and how that's like not okay.
Well, even the Joker specifically says, as he's starting all of these, like inspiring all of these riots that are based on like class disparity and wealth disparity, and he specifically says, I'm not political, I'm murdering people because I can. And I'm like, we get it, Todd. You don't want to take responsibility for the conversations you're starting. At least that's how it read to me.
No, yeah, I think there's some, so a lot of interviews I've seen of him, he kind of has that same vibe where he just wanted to introduce the idea, but not say how he feels about it, which to me is kind of a crime about filmmaking. I think that's what films should be about, like your view or your idea or what you have to say about this specific topic. Some of my favorite filmmakers, I feel like when I watch the movies, that's what I get. It's clear cut, like, oh, this is what Kubrick had to say about, the future in 2001, or, like, just, it's really odd that he doesn't take ownership of that. I guess to go back to your point about he didn't plan it to be a blockbuster, I could kind of see that because it's not a very like summer blockbustery movie. It is disguising itself as like a more auteur-y, and I think the budget may have even been like maybe 75 to 50 million, so like relatively cheap as far as movies go. And from what I remember hearing is WB didn't even want to like finance half of it. They didn't believe in it or think that it could work. And I think Todd had to like finance either half or like a quarter of it himself. So which kind of shot WB in the foot when it became $1 billion movie, because it was, it was a rated R Joker movie, and at the time I guess they couldn't really see the profit in it. And I'm actually really curious now as to, will WB try to like make Lightning Strike Twice? And not necessarily a sequel to this movie, but like, I had a friend who we kind of talk about this movie, and his gripe is that he feels like the Joker isn't as interesting without Batman. Like, Joker is a really great foil to Batman, and I used to didn't really believe that, but I think it's more like as I get further along, a lot of my favorite Joker stories do have that. Well, Batman is it's him and Batman. It's the sort of different ideologies battling it out. But like, what if this movie was about Two-Face or Clayface or the Ventriloquist? Like, what if it was about any other one of Batman's villains who, if you ever watch the 90s animated show, it holds up so well, but it really shows how like different Batman villains are sort of faces for different mental illnesses. So, what if they actually made a Clayface movie that like had to deal with a guy with identity disorder? Would that be more interesting, or is that even what WB wants to do from now on? I can't imagine you make $1 billion movie and you don't try to make that again. But yeah,
it's not Hollywood's MO.
Say from the director who did 3 Hangovers.
right.
Yeah.
Could I answer my own question too? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
I just I mean, I read some commentary about the movie sort of around the time it came out, and I remember a couple people saying that their sense that this film would lack staying power, and I mean, I think it's in some ways it's probably already expired, just in terms of any sort of larger conversation, because it does sort of fit into this cliche about white privilege and although we might, and like the white patriarchal society, which, Brittany, I think there's room for debate about like, well, how is that bad for everyone? Well, we know it's certainly bad for non-white, non-male people in our society. So like, I feel like that part of the debate is over, but I wonder, would it still have the same financial success? Who knows?
So we are out of time, but I did want to invite everyone to share maybe like a sentence, something they're taking away from this, or just like they're like, this is my stance. Either or both.
I think you offered some interesting things to continue to think about in regards to how it represents or can be representing mental health, but I do still lean a little towards the director, Todd Phillips, could have considered more of the implications and the social landscape that he was releasing this movie into, because he's not releasing it into a vacuum. So like there are going to be things that people bring to it and take away from it that one should consider as the director, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think even though I still kind of stand where I stand with the film, I do think the one thing it did that film should do is open up a conversation, which is like what it's done with all of us. So I do appreciate it for that. Yeah.
Among the things I'll take away from the conversation is this comment, that the point that Tim made about, Todd Phillips started a conversation, but he didn't really sort of add to it, and so that'll be my takeaway.
And I will say that I think my takeaway from this conversation is that I think I was really looking for a lot of reasons to like the film, and I still do appreciate how different people can look at it and have different perspectives. But we could definitely have films out there that have a stronger voice to work toward destigmatizing mental health and poverty, and having more frank conversations about racial inequity and injustice. And that's really what the world needs, right? Not just like, you could take it anyway. I mean, art is art and you can interpret it no matter what. But I think that for this film specifically, there was a little bit too much of feeding the stigma compared to challenging it. All righty. Thank you, guys.
All right.